connect with people who are inspiring, who have shifted paradigms and used their creative voice to make a difference. And one of those people today is K Ream. I'm so blessed. I met Ann in Chicago about a year and a half now. I had gone to a meeting at JCARES, which is the Jewish Community Abuse Response Education and Solutions, and she was presenting, and I was blown away. The material that she was sharing with us just resonated. And then I was so blessed because then last year, almost about a year ago, I got to participate in a 2-day workshop with Ann. So I'm so happy to have Ann on our call, and she is the director of, the founder of Voices and Faces Project, an award-winning documentary initiative that is focused on women's issues. She is also a music background. She's a longtime fan, rock and roll fan, and she's a contributing author to the Cambridge Companion to Bob Dylan, and she's also the executive producer of a new record that's come out, and I want you to hear all about Ann. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Ray.
So let's start with a little bit who and what inspires you?
Wow, what a great question. I mean, the who's, there are probably too many who's for me to name, but when I think about my history in activism, I always think of a couple. One was Dolores Huerta, who was the co-founder of United Farm Workers and really drove the grape boycott in the 70s. And my parents were very active Methodists, and I remember, I don't know, I couldn't have been more than 4 years old at that time, but I remember my mom sitting down with us and talking to us about why we weren't going to buy grapes because laborers were not being paid a living or sustainable wage. I don't think they called it that then, but that's what we were referring to. And my mom talking to me about the importance of recognizing that every one of our actions is having consequences, that not only in big ways in terms of what we stood for and what we spoke out about, not only in large ways do we have the potential to be activists, but also in smaller ways, what we buy, what we produce. And so that was sort of my first introduction to activism. And then I have to say, you referenced that I love music. I also really love literature, as you know, from the writing workshop. And when I was a young girl growing up in Wheaton, Illinois, that was really some of my earliest introductions to the idea of a bigger and broader world came through literature and rock and roll, and that way that the arts open our eyes to what's out in the world and challenge us to think differently about our place in that world and what we can do to change the world really was kind of a catalyst for my own activism and I hope my own work with other people.
Oh, that's so beautifully said, yes. So let's talk about your work. I mean, it's go ahead. I'm going to let you talk about it.
Oh, I know.
Rather than me, nice. At this point, I'm going to let you talk about your work because I am inspired every day thinking about what you're doing. So
that's lovely of you. Well, I've always been very interested in the way that stories make statistics real, that stories take concepts that we may have a hard time understanding or we may understand in the abstract, and they bring them to us in a way that we have to confront them, and we feel in a powerful way. And so I'd spent the early part of my career working on social justice issues and communications issues. My first real job was working for a grassroots lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and working on progressive social justice issues and thinking about how to change minds and hearts, and particularly certain public policies. And as I was working on those issues and throughout the first part of my career in communications, I really saw over and over again that the way that we break through is through the power of story. And I was, of course, at that time working on gender justice issues to some degree because I myself am a survivor of sexual violence. And I was very struck at that time by the absence of voices and faces around the issue of sexual violence or sexual exploitation, the way that for a lot of really important reasons, people often decide not to go public with their experiences, but the way that there had been this sort of disappearing of these stories in the culture. And so the first project that I really embarked on my own was what was supposed to be, I always say it's the nonprofit that ate the book. It was supposed to be a literary project, and myself and Patricia Evans decided to travel across North America, and ultimately we made it more of a global project, but travel and interview and photograph survivors of gender-based violence to really create a series of narrative profiles that would show them as shaped by what had been done to them, but not defined by what had been done to them. You know, we really immersed ourselves in the lives of these women, and in a handful of cases men, and in their communities, so we could create this series of profiles. And so I initially embarked on that as a book project, and when Patricia and I started to travel, we started to recognize that what we were really collecting was an extraordinary body of stories, and that there were so many other ways and places beyond simply the book that these stories could be brought to bear to change minds and hearts. And this all was sort of happening not necessarily at the dawn of the Internet, but really, 2004, 2005, when digital storytelling projects were not something we saw frequently, and certainly people were not using the Internet or social media in any way to push stories out into the public consciousness. So we stepped back and said, we obviously have the makings of a really wonderful book, and that, as you know, was subsequently published, Lived Through This. But then we said, if we have these stories, how can we create an initiative, an organization that's really all about finding ways and places to allow people to testify to their own experiences and to also get those stories out there. So the Voices and Faces Project is really what came out of that vision. And
can you tell people a little bit some of the challenges that you embarked on? Because this is a learning experience for people. Like, they may have this great idea and they need to know what are some of the challenges and how you overcame them. Because this is a big project. This is not a little project going from a book, a national book, to global, consciousness, and then creating a documentary.
Yeah, that's really a great question, and I probably repressed some of the memories of some of those challenges at this point. But what I can tell you with absolute clarity is that it was a much larger undertaking than I ever imagined, and if it wasn't for this extraordinary sisterhood of a handful, we called the women who helped co-found Voices and Faces, we kind of called ourselves the Wednesday team because we met every Wednesday. It was Patricia Evans and Courtney Comer and Krista Dayseer and Amy Bravo-Knopfinger. A couple of those folks, by the way, are graduates of the writing workshop. And we sat down and just said, what do we do? How do you even start a nonprofit? What's step one? And recognize that we would need a lot of heart, a lot of organization, because when you're first starting something like this, you have to kind of organize your own thoughts, but also your own community. We had to get really comfortable very quickly meeting with people and saying, this is what this organization is going to be or is. Was
it a group vision did you have a shared vision that you created together? Was it more along your vision? And how did you get people on board?
It probably was initially really myself and Patricia Evans thinking through what we wanted the book to be, and then coming back, and it happened really organically, that we started saying, I think there's a there. There's something bigger. Hey, Krista, what do you think? Or Courtney, what do you think? And all these conversations kind of emerged organically. And then, I sort of drafted our original principles and the website and the language and our mission and our vision. But it was so informed by these conversations that we were having as a group. And what worked, I have to say, it was the most ego-free group you could imagine, which is another thing. I think if you're starting something, surrounding yourself with people who, A, share your vision, B, recognize that it's one thing to have a great idea and another thing to execute a great idea, and the execution stage is everything. And do you have people around you, or are you yourself someone who will really be able to focus, take on the big picture task, like coming up with a vision or mission, but also take on the smaller task, like who's going to the copier. I mean, there are a lot of things that were not that glamorous about that process. And then it was having the flexibility to kind of say, this organization, the idea for this organization really grew out of listening to survivors. And if survivors are telling us that they need or want something, how do we respond to that? And really, the idea for the stories we tell, which is, of course, the testimonial writing workshop you took part in, which is now the Voices and Faces Project signature initiative, that's an example of that.
Why don't you just tell people a little bit about that and how that came to be? Because I think it's such a important piece for anybody who is struggling, and you offer this all over the country at different times, so people need to hear about that.
Yeah, it's called The Stories We Tell. It's North America's, and in fact now we've taken it both to South Africa and also recently piloted a version of the workshop for young girls, formerly incarcerated girls in Cook County. But it's the first testimonial writing workshop in North America dedicated and targeted to survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, trafficking, and other human rights violations. And as opposed to sort of the traditional model of writing therapy, which is a wonderful model, and those are really important programs, we really wanted to create an immersive 2-day writing program for people who are ready to write or speak about the injustices they've lived or witnessed in a way that created social and political change, or political change. And it's a very reading and writing focused workshop, as you know well. So
I was what I loved most was reading. I can't remember the piece from Alabama from Martin Luther King and
Letter from a Birmingham jail. Yeah.
Right, and I had not read that before, and starting to think about those kind of questions from a different perspective. I thought that was great, bringing in a Holocaust, a voice, things like that. I thought it was really very empowering. So
yeah, I give a full credit, and this is perhaps something else that may be interesting for folks who are listening in on this conversation. That the workshop pedagogy, the reading list, the writing exercises, that is all in a huge way driven by Clifton Spargo, who's the co-creator of this program. Ray, as you know, not only an extraordinary novelist and writer, but just one of the all-time great writing teachers. He comes out of the Iowa Writers Workshop and marries a real sense of the power of the written word to the work he's done at the Holocaust Museum on testimony. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And so when we created the program, what he really wanted to do was look at powerful testimonial writing or speaking across social movements and history, bring that writing to the attention of our writers, and then through a series of exercises challenge them to think about how they can share their own stories and testimonies in a way that creates change, poetry, memoir, speech writing, fiction, creative nonfiction. And that program, when we started the Voices and Faces Project, that program wasn't even on the radar. We were doing a host
again, it was an
things.
Organic growing out of one thing. Yeah.
It was just sort of listening, because part of what was happening is Patricia and I were out doing interviews for the book, and then starting to build this archive. We have one of the largest, I think it is actually the largest archive of sexual violence survivor testimony in the country, and we were out collecting these stories. And very often, after I would interview someone, they'd pull me aside and say, "Oh, I want you to read this," and it would be copies of pages in their journal or poetry they had written. And I would come back, and Clifton had been involved with the Voices and Faces Project since the beginning, and would tell him this. And he was the one who initially said, Ann, if there's that much hunger to write and create, there's a writing program here. But you asked earlier about challenges. One of the hardest challenges for me and for us is it took us 5 years to find a funder for that program, because at the time that we conceived it, now kind of storytelling in quotes is sort of a buzzword in social justice movements. You hear it a lot more. But when we were conceiving the writing workshop, most funders in the community would say to us, well, you're not offering legal advocacy and you're not direct services. You're not a direct services agency. So what is this program? And we don't fund programs that aren't one of those two things. And we just kept banging our head against the wall because we were offering something that was really different. It wasn't a therapeutic program, although it can be, as you know from your own experience, quite extraordinarily healing to be a part of it. But it also wasn't a traditional legal advocacy. And so we just kept trying. And then finally we got really lucky. And a Verizon Foundation actually funded our pilot program at the Chicago Cultural Center, and that workshop was so extraordinary. In fact, one of the writers came out of that workshop and, in response to one of Clifton's writing exercises, conceived a young adult novel that months later was published by Simon & Schuster. We helped nurture that project. And to have such an extraordinary outcome out of the first workshop, now lots of our alums have gone on to write and speak, to do what you're doing, to lobby on Capitol Hill, to work on a one-act play. And so once we just had that one case study, it became easier for us. So I guess the other lesson perhaps in there is this notion of if you really believe in an idea, don't give up on it. Find some way to test your hypotheses that you've got something brilliant, and once you've done it, get out there and share that case study in as many ways and places as you possibly can.
I think that's really important because we don't think about the case studies necessarily. We have a passion. We want to change the world, but that case study, especially in creativity as that healing tool and tool for social change, it is not still widely recognized. It just isn't, and so I applaud you for being one of the first to go out there and say, we have something different and let's try it. So
that's a great point about, we were really fortunate in that we've, as you know, because you're one of the workshop alums, we really remain in constant contact. There are now 225 people have come through this program, and Janet, who works with our project, is constantly communicating with the writers about publishing opportunities or initiatives they might want to know about. And so 5 years out, we actually did a long-term evaluation of the program. How had this writing workshop affected folks who had come through the program, not a year or two later, but 3 or 4 or 5 years later. And I think that was another learning we had, that funders of programs like
they like numbers.
They like numbers, and they want to know that if you've invested in an initiative, that somehow it not only changes the lives of women and girls in the short term, but there are longer-term repercussions of the program, not only in the life of that person, but their family and their community. And so that I think part of what we always focus on here is, I'm all about the idea, and we'd just rather stay out there and do the work. But I have a couple really terrific colleagues who will constantly say, let's evaluate this, or let's look at this. Can we make a better case for this in a different way? And that kind of thinking, having a group of people who approach projects very differently, but respect one another's expertise, I think is also a really helpful.
I think that's a great point, is having that diversity on your team, and that is key. It also helps in the creative process, when we have diverse voices and you're not just listening to your own. I've been, that's one of the reasons I'm doing this summit, is because I want to create a movement of people. I want the creative activists to be engaged and empowered and work with each other, because again, we're all competing for the same dollars, and so let's see if there are ways we can work together instead of in silos.
Well, and it's I think one of the great joys of this work, at least for me, for example, when we recently piloted the writing workshop for Cook County, for formerly incarcerated girls in Cook County, we partnered with Chicago's Rape Victim Advocates. We partnered with the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. We partnered with a local foundation focused on these issues. We brought in some private sector folks because we worked with the girls to create a magazine of their writing. And for me, the joy of the program, in a sense, beyond just working with these extraordinary girls who we all just fell in love with, the joy of the program was sitting down and saying, if we really want to bring something wonderful into this community, who do we know we can tap into to make it infinitely better than it would be if it was just voices and faces on our own? And
bravo. That is exactly what I believe.
I mean, and I know that sometimes, I think because you're right, you hit on something that's really hard, which is that, all of these organizations can be revenue challenged, and there's a limit full of dollars, and it's hard, it's sometimes.
And I also think it's hard to let go of control in the sense like you have this idea, you've had this organization, and sometimes you have to flow a little more and change, I'm not going to say change your mission, but your vision of how it's going to be accomplished. There's so much ownership, and I've experienced in all the years I've been a volunteer, that somebody doesn't want to partner with you because, I'm going to take my cookies and go home kind of attitude because, we've always done it this way versus let's see what we can do together.
And I think when you have that mindset, that openness to collaboration, not even just openness, but you actually enjoy it, you tend then to attract like-minded people, and you create a culture of collaboration. And I've always felt that one of the lovely things about the team at the Voices and Faces Project and our Stories We Tell team, and hopefully you actually saw it in the writing workshop, that there's really only one rule that we ask people to abide by, which is that we can disagree, but we have to disagree respectfully, and we have got to listen to each other. And when you create those rules, or a non-rule in a certain sense, and then welcome other people into the conversation and genuinely do mean it when you say, I want you to challenge me if you don't agree, or let's talk about it if there's a better way to do this. I think it frees people up and they feel drawn to that culture. And we've always, I think this is a national, Voices and Faces is a national organization. Stories We Tell is a national program, now a North American program. But we're Chicago-based, but we have key folks on the West Coast and the East Coast. And if we, in this really fast-moving world, if you're not effectively collaborating and you're not supportive of one another, nothing will happen. You just stall, and it's a missed opportunity for you as an organization, but also for all of us as human beings, because you kind of want to like this work when you're doing it.
Right. I mean, because you can burn out pretty quickly otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think, too, then we miss the opportunity of really serving more people, because that's what it's ultimately about, is creating that space for people to live a better life, to be fully engaged and vibrant and reaching their full potential. Because that's what, when you see violence around the world, especially, toward women, whether it's when they are limited, they keep small. They aren't living an authentic life, and so I believe that we need to create those opportunities for them, and that's all part of this dialogue. So I thank you so much for talking about this.
That's a lovely way to put it.
Thank you. I have a couple questions about your own creativity, and your process and how you create. You're a writer, you're into music, you're into a lot of things, so let's talk about that a little bit.
I'm ready. Do you want, so it's funny, one of my biggest challenges, at least lately, is triaging ideas, meaning on any given day, I might wake up and think, I'd love to write something about that, or this would be a fantastic new initiative for Voices and Faces, or I've got to get on the phone with blank because we need to include this in our workshop reading lists, and I need to ask if they'd come and perform it. And my own process, I think that people who create create well tend to be people who are continually exposed to other people's creations. Meaning, are you constantly, how do you listen? How do you look? How do you learn? Do you read? Are you, what stimulates you? And for me, the core of creativity in a certain sense is critical thinking, sort of always being in a conversation with the world around me, whether it's a literal conversation with the people around me, or sort of the conversation that's occurring when you're walking through the world and seeing something that you want to change or to challenge. And so I think my own process, when I think back to writing my book, that was, I think one of the things I discounted until I actually was confronted with doing this was how much discipline it takes to actually take an idea and actually write the book.
Mm-hmm.
That was the process of going out and doing the interviews. I mean, in a certain sense, when I think back on that, from the sheer amount of, Patricia and I interviewed and photographed over 100 survivors of gender-based violence, and we were, on 3 continents ultimately. And when I think back on that process, that took an infinitely longer period of time to do those interviews and collect the photos. But the 4 or 5 months that I spent intensively writing the book were some of the most difficult, beautiful, but beautifully difficult months of my life, because for me, the writing of that book, I realized in myself that I couldn't just go about my day-to-day and then step out of my day-to-day and get super focused and write for a few hours, that I needed to take myself out of my own life on what was really ended up being an extended writer's retreat, so I could just focus.
Did you do it here, or did you go somewhere else to do it?
No, I went south. My stepfather is originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, so I went to the Ozarks, and I stayed there. I did one summer when I was working on the book proposal, and a second summer when I actually finished and wrote the whole manuscript for the book, and just really isolated myself. I'm a complete city girl. I live right downtown Chicago, and it was, I love the country, but it's always a shock to my system to be in the country. And I was really isolated. I mean, this was a house that's in a really remote area on a lake, and they happened to, part of that time that I was there, they were in China, and so the house was completely empty. It was me and 4 dogs, and every now and then when I was going really crazy, I'd have some human contact. But it was necessary for me to sort of say, this is the last push of this major creative project, and it's going to be the most painful push, and you've got to just do it. And I think that was completely necessary. And then I think the other thing, anyone who's ever, produced something like a book or some other finite project, by the time you're done with it, you really feel done with it. You're done. But then, of course, the book comes out 6 months later, and then
you've got to promote it, and
exactly,
then you've got to
the project's new to the rest of the world, and in your mind, you sort of moved on. The only difference was this was not a project I would ever really move on from. I was so invested in these stories and the people I was writing about in the book that I felt really so honored that they shared their stories with me and duty bound. But the process was, I don't think it's always hard to know where your ideas come from and what that spark is and which ideas to follow. But once you've committed to a project, that I see a lot of people who have such wonderful ideas, and I think the most difficult part is taking it absolutely to completion. It just is.
And so, if there are moments, and you could give somebody a tip, what would be some of those tips to take it to completion? Because we all run through, we go through those blocks, and it gets really hard. And So
yeah, I mean, for me, there were a couple. One, just because of the nature of this project, I really felt that I had really entered into sort of a social contract with every single person I had interviewed. And if there was ever a moment that I wavered and thought, I'm exhausted, or this is tiring, or writing these profiles is really hard, because it was, in all honesty, Ray, there were some moments where emotionally it was a very hard project for me, for reasons you would understand, having come through our writing program. And I remembered the promise that I had made to people, and that kind of kept me going. And I played tennis when I was younger, and my father, I would always say, is kind of the great Santini of the suburbs or something. You know, he was just an incredibly demanding person. And I remember at one point I wanted to quit tennis mid-season. And he said, you can do anything you want, but you never quit mid-season. You don't give up halfway. And so I kind of had those voices in my head. And then I also think for creative people, the other thing that was exciting for me was when I lost faith in the project, was visualizing what it would be. You know, kind of imagining it out there and what it could mean and what it could be and what it could do in the world. And I think during those moments when you are having a hard time with what's right in front of you, kind of envisioning where it's going to go can be hugely helpful. And then I think does that make sense?
Yes,
Oh, no,
I mean, I
ahead.
have a vision. So I write out a vision. I have one. It's 3 years out in the future. And I envision the people and the faces that are being helped. And I envision the community I'm building. And I envision this world that is very different. And so, and that's what keeps me motivated and inspired in those tough times, yes.
Well, and don't you think also, I mean, I think the other thing that helped me, and this wasn't something that I set up consciously, but in retrospect, it was a big piece of what kept this project moving during some moments that maybe where I maybe was wavering, is that I had said to enough people around me, I'm doing this. And I had this great community, you know, that Wednesday team I mentioned, my family, a handful of folks around me who I felt consciously or unconsciously really accountable to, beyond just the people I had written about. But there's another community of folks who I just sort of felt like, you know, I've told you I'm doing this, and I want to be the person who gets the job done in some way. And they kind of nudged me a little. And in fact, Clifton, of course, who's the creator of our writing workshop, he was the one who kind of gently said at one point, you know, you could keep going infinitely with collecting these interviews and photos, and maybe maybe that's what you need to do. But you might also want to think, is there a reason? Are you hesitating? Like, is there some reason that you're not ready to dive into the writing of the book? And if that's true, that's okay. Or is it possible you're afraid? Or is it possible that your life is just so full right now with so many other things that unless you really say to everyone around you, I'm going on leave, I'm going to finish this book, it won't happen. So he saw, you know, I had enough close friends and mentors around me who sort of saw the struggle and were willing to call it out in a really loving way.
No, I think that's really important to have that container of support and to have people around you who can tell you the truth and in a kind, gentle way, as you just said, and point it out. Because, you know, I fear to me is very tricky because it sounds very rational. You know, it's like, you know, last year, your mother is sick. Your mother died. Well, but no, I made this commitment, you know, and it's like, and fear can do that. And everything sounds like they're taking care of you and it's very rational. But it is also that piece that's just like, that's a distraction oftentimes. So.
Well, and there's always going to be often really good, important reasons not. The world does not revolve around these. The world revolves around a lot of things. There are a lot of things sort of built into the structure of our day-to-day lives that, you know, we're going to be sure we eat every day, we pay our taxes, we do some basic, we get our kids to school. The world's going to kind of demand that. We're going to demand it of ourselves. But a creative project, by virtue of what it is, most creative projects are not projects someone's out there saying, I expect you to get this done.
Right. They're more what I call passion projects, where it's something that you care deeply about. And yes, maybe somebody gave you an advance and you got to get it in, but yeah, I agree with you. So.
Yeah, and so you have to almost recognize that there's always going to be a force shifting your attention toward the more pragmatic, practical thing.
Right.
And that passion project, I love those words, Ray, but that passion project is going to be the thing that the world is going to consciously or unconsciously tell you is the easiest thing to give up.
Right.
And so if you're not as protective of that project as you would be of another human being, I mean, you almost have to see the project as a living entity. Like, my responsibility to you is to get you out into the world. Right. And if you do that, if you can see it that way, you tend to be invested in it in a way that actually allows you to actualize the idea, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's perfect. Well, we're starting to run out of time, so I have one last question for you. What is the legacy you'd like to leave?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question and a hard question. I think, and a lofty question, by the way. For me, I think I'd like to leave the people around me with a sense that to question and to challenge is one of the most beautiful, honorable things you can do. And that the act of sort of loving the world enough to demand better of it, loving the people around you enough to demand that they be kinder, gentler, more compassionate, more understanding, is a part of probably the aspect of, if I have anything like a legacy, what my legacy that would be most dear to me. And then I think that I also want people to have loved or at least enjoyed their time with me, that the work, as hard as this work can be, that we can eke out a space doing some of the most difficult work in the world, working with survivors of gender-based violence or trafficking, and still feel joy in that work in the day-to-day, not joy in what we're challenging, because there's nothing joyful about violence or abuse, but a joy in intimately engaging with other people in their struggle. And I hope people who have worked with me or with our project or come to our writing workshop have felt that there's joy and beauty in being a part of this struggle.
There is. And how can people get a hold of you?
So our website, voicesandfaces.org, that is a great place to check out our projects, or they can email me at aream@voicesandfaces.org. And we're launching in the fall an national anti-trafficking coalition called worldwithoutexploitation.org. And that's a separate place where folks can get in touch and find out more about the different storytelling and other projects we're doing on gender justice.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for participating. And listeners, this was such a rich conversation. Thank you, Anne. And I hope you made some notes for yourself. And just make a commitment to yourself today that you're going to take one action step toward your dream, whether it is writing that book or just learning about something new, some aspect of this conversation that intrigued you. Just get on her website, find out more. So thank you, everybody. I so appreciate it, and we will talk to you another day. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Ray. Take care.
Bye.